Good morning. You're on the Late Breakfast Show with Ben Vidgen's Deadline Report, or Ben Vidgen Investigates. You're on Fresh FM. I've been doing for the last few weeks a series looking at the road to 9/11, and that in turn leads to the road to March 15th, or my personal journey along this road. Explain my academic background, explain about pre-World War II connections of events that happened today, talking about some of these organisations, what they're up to in the 70s and the 80s, and then talking about what I was seeing literally in the weeks or a year and writing about before 9/11, which kind of basically shows you the fact that when they say they didn't know what's going to happen, that's a load of rubbish. And talking about some of the events that actually happened on 9/11, which kind of show you that they never really had an investigation, and that there was also lots of lies told, and those lies led to a war in which thousands of people occurred. And this is something that, of course, these organisations that are involved in the usual suspects, I call them, do time and time and time again. And so for corporate media or mainstream to turn around and suggest that terrorism attacks and conspiracies don't actually happen, it's nonsense. And it's really it's an interesting, as we'll lead today, about what's actually going on when you actually scratch beneath the surface, and why we should all be very aware and very alarmed about with what's actually happening. Now, after 9/11, which is 2001, you also have coincides with things like people like Julian Assange, whistleblowing, Private Manning, and again, these people with things like WikiLeaks really have exposed the full level of corruption that goes within a lot of the current states that we call, Western democratic states. It's also very interesting because we'll start off from this viewpoint, is that there's this official narration today that no one knew that right-wing terrorism was extremism. We all have to be on the lookout for neo-Nazis because they're out there, and we've only just woken up to it. Well, that's all a load of toshly bibbly bobbly bollocks. Let me just run you through a couple of dates to paint you a picture. 1973. There is the attempted invasion of the little island, basically virtually under the water during full tide of Minerva, little island on part belonging to Tonga. It's invaded by the Phoenix Foundation, or a cartel of largely of ex-American Special Forces, ex-American intelligence services, the Association for Former Intelligence Officers, or predates that. An organisation which would later be led by William Casey, who led the Iran-Contra, which not only saw the arming of right-wing terrorist groups in Nicaragua and Central America, but obviously also saw the arming of the Taliban and Osama bin Laden, which would later on lead to 9/11, of which there are lots of unanswered questions, and unfortunately the official status quo tries to make out that that's an incredibly loony thing to have suggestions. Now, the interesting thing about this, of course, is at that point, and a lot of people that are intelligent, educated, thinking people, up until probably 2 years ago, definitely prior to March 15, would be what you would call, in loose circles, they would be left-wing, and you have people like Bill Hicks doing a story. Today there is a suggestion that if you critique the government, then you must be right-wing. This is, again, not true. It is a fiction, and it's actually a way of marginalising an element of society, which then permits the state to demonise them. The reality is, of course, the people we actually look at who have been actually carrying out these events repeatedly come from right-wing circles. So 1973, you've got Minerva. 1980, you've got the uprising in Vanuatu, the Santos uprising, and where, again, Christian Seventh-day Adventists, the Phoenix Foundation, are behind attempted separatist uprising in Vanuatu by people that want to create a tax haven, money laundering, little do what they bloody will please paradise in Vanuatu. Interesting point too, because as I said last night when I was talking about this with somebody, that where did it happen? Do you think it was the New Zealand government, or the Australian government, or the American government, or the British government, or the French government that stepped in and stopped the uprising occurring? No, it was actually the very impoverished government of the PNG were the only ones that actually came to the assistance of the actual legitimate government during this coup, which I think says a lot. 1987, you now have Methodist lay preacher. So again, Santos, Minerva, and now Fiji all have a Christian element to it, of Siviti Rambuka, also known by the New Zealand military as Steve, because they trained him and he did his thesis in Bloodless Coup and Victoria University. Um, on the eve of that coup, there was up to 12 members of the various members of the American intelligence community, either former Air American pilots, which was the CIA's airline, former CIA officers, or former members of the Association of Former Intelligence Officers, AFIO. So today, when you, for example, you look at Billy Bullshit and the NZPP, there's two I see is Michael Stace, who, aside from having these old boy connections, which we'll ignore. I mean, people know what you say about when you say about old boys, if they don't, so we'll just move along that. But more significantly on that basis, was that Michael Stace is also a member of the AFIO. So again, you get this repeating conservative right-wing element that's been there all the way back to the 70s. So when they say, oh, we had no idea that this was going to happen, well, history shows otherwise. And we sort of, as a turnaround force, fast forward this a wee bit. You had attempted the uprisings or attempted mercenary events in Papua New Guinea, where the former head of the SAS, Tim Spicer, who went on to run all the Commonwealth mercenaries operating in Iraq, is arrested bringing the mercenaries into PNG. He's doing that on behalf of his clients, who are people like Peter Monk, who run Emperor Mining in PNG. Peter Monk, of course, also ran Emperor Mining. Sorry, he ran a mine in PNG, but he ran Emperor Mining, which was a gold mine in Fiji, who was also a partner of Adnan Khashoggi, who provided Siviti Rambuka with his guns. And Adnan Khashoggi was one of the very much the middle people behind the Iran-Contra, which, as I said beforehand, when William Casey, the member of the AFIO, was teaming up with people like General Singlab and using former neo-Nazis and far-right to basically support terrorist and paramilitary organizations of the far-right in Nicaragua, and again supporting Islamic terrorism in the form of the Taliban in Afghanistan. So you're starting to see the same usual suspects, the same faces appear again and again. And these are the people which traditionally our government every year spends massive hundreds of millions of dollars we hand over to them so that they can keep everything under surveillance and protect us from terrorists. Well, maybe if we didn't give these people the money, they wouldn't have the money to go around and cause us shit, and we wouldn't have terrorism in the first place. And this is fairly, it's a fairly, it isn't conspiracy theory, it's history, because it's all documented, people. This is why it's going on. The sheer absence of oversight and accountability in intelligence services is it's excessive. And yet, today, when you look at what's happening today we see this submergence of the supposedly alt-right that just popped out of nowhere. We don't actually have our government turn around and say, well, actually, we're going to make sure that the spies are, have to put everything accountable. We're going to have a terrorist attack and make sure that the royal inquiry is actually all open and transparent. And, there's a reason why we need to make this actually happen, so that people actually do have trust in our government. Because if you do everything behind closed door, people start getting distrustful. And, of course, it's going to be a breeding ground for extreme ideas. So again, if the government, really, really, really did want to stamp out the idea of people being suspicious of it, then perhaps they should actually operate in a more transparent and accountable manner than they have been traditionally doing so. In the 1980s, during the period of the Fiji Siviti Rambuka coup, you also had people like Sue Woods, that was actually in Fiji at the time. She was the president of the National Party. But Sue Woods was also a member of what they called the brain has gone. No, it hasn't gone blank. We're gonna we will drag it out of the depths of our brain. It was the Project Democracy. She was a member of a thing called Project Democracy, which was in TVNZ in 1987. Eyewitness was the program. Exposed that this group of people were actually having little meetings in Wellington, include Les Scander involved, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Hugh Templeton, and they were meeting with Malcolm Fraser, who was the former Prime Minister of Australia, who would then go on to run charities like Care Australia, same charity which was used by Simon Spitz when he left Lugano in Switzerland, where he'd been running guns, came to New Zealand, did the same thing but based in New Zealand under the guise of doing work for UN charities, including Care Australia, the charity that's led by a man, Malcolm Fraser, that has a history of working with spooks, and it had done so during the 1980s with this thing called Project Democracy. Project Democracy was actually the idea of using Western governments to support for raising money for guns, for terrorist organisations, and providing logistical support. That was largely overseen by a man called Richard V. Allen. Richard V. Allen was the former national security for Ronald Reagan during the 1980s. Today he lives part-time in New Zealand in Queensland, where once upon a time he tried to sue me, and I basically laughed at him and published his letter in my own paper, and I never heard from him ever again. Although his own letter to me did confirm the fact that the Iran-Contra affair, the very thing that began the Iran-Contra affair, he said was kicked off by Robert McFarlane, who's Colonel Robert McFarlane, went on to be the next National Security Advisor, is listed in New Zealand as the Director of Safe Air, which is a little subsidiary of Air New Zealand that operates out of Blenheim and has a very, very interesting history, but they handle all of the military avionics for New Zealand's own Air Force needs, but also for the US as well as Israel. Robert McFarlane, who Vanity Fair said was a spy for Israel, Ronald McFarlane tried to sue Vanity Fair, just like Richard V. Allen tried to sue me. Again, lost his lawsuit because basically Vanity Fair were able to actually back up what they actually were saying. So outed as an asset for Israeli intelligence, but Richard V. Allen turned around and said, well, this was the man that introduced me to the people that began the whole, what we now know as the Iran-Contra affair, and that this man was actually working, ostensibly was the precise word that Richard V. Allen would say to me, working ostensibly for a US senator. The US senator was Senator John Towers. Now, John Towers was the chairman of what became known as the Tower Commission. And this was the investigation of whether or not Presidents Ronald Reagan and Presidents George Bush. So please don't think that Donald Trump is the only stupid, dangerous American president that America has ever had, because they have a very long history of electing stupid, dangerous presidents. He was elected to chair the investigation into whether these two had knowledge of the criminal activities that were participated in the Iran-Contra. This is again the supplying of weapons to the Taliban in Afghanistan, the supporting of right-wing, far-right Nicaraguan terrorist organizations in South America. Again, organizations that have in turn links to far neo-Nazi organizations, and of which the answer, the investigation was no, they did not. But again, the letter that Richard V. Allen told me said was that Robert McFarlane, the man that they later would turn around and pick to investigate whether or not the presidents were aware of any wrongdoing, was the man that orchestrated the Iran-Contra to begin with. So they sent their own person to investigate themselves. Now, when you look at events like that, which most of our corporate media people would never go near in a million years, because that would actually be doing their jobs. These are examples why people are right to be distrustful of Western governments, and right for New Zealand to say, no, we don't want your American war toys here, because ultimately you are right-wing. So if the government's really truthful about being against alt-white right supremacists, then maybe we need to kick some of the American Yankee toys, which are rapidly popping up in New Zealand, out. Because otherwise, it's the same situation. It's all talking about lovely to around, put little selfies of our head of state wearing hijabs, or policewoman looking beautiful and poignant wearing hijabs on one level, and yet at the same time we were having an inquiry into the war crimes committed by our own defence forces in places like Afghanistan, because of our involvement in these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we are a contributing factor towards the murder of civilians done on the grounds for people's, in the case of Iraq, oil, and Afghanistan, conflict minerals, which are good for telecommunications and all the things which we're now being told will save us from climate change, but will still mess up the earth when we mine the crap out of it. This is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a cognitive dissonance where people want to accept one theory of the talk, a talk that makes out that our government is so liberal and so left wing, when the reality is their walk means that they are this right wing, totalitarian fascist supporting. And I'm literally, as I've said to you the last 3 shows, showing you how the far right have actually consistently worked with Western intelligence. So literally, we have a Western intelligence system that is absolutely rooted and infiltrated by a fascist ideology and a fascist mindset culture. There is, I'm not using that word. I'm just lashing out because it sounds like I'm being literally, by definition, saying this is what's going on. And if we're not able to actually examine that, or have the ability to put our questions to our government about these inconsistencies and have it done in an open, transparent way, we should all be very, very worried. And this is where we're heading. More and more, our governments are getting excessive powers to do mass surveillance. Again, during Operation 8, the Americans, we got the passing of the 2007 Terrorist Act, which allows now the Americans, not us, but the Americans, to define who is and who is not a terrorist. We don't even have control of our own sovereign right to decide who is actually one of us and who is one of them. They now get to decide for us. Think about that. When we look at the events of March 15th, we turn around and we're told, and I'm not going to worry about any music today, I think we're just going to try and get as much of this in as we can. When we are told about these events, we are told that we had no idea that this was going to occur. This is repeating, the same drum. Oh my God, drummer boy beating the same tune again. In the case of March 15th, we're told that we had no idea that this was actually going to take place. And yet, in 2015, we have a live shooting event take place in the United States. The person attempts to live stream it. It's put on live stream, it doesn't quite pull off, but that's the attempt to do so. The next day, somebody on one of these platforms, which Brenton Tarrant has now been known to actually be involved in, says, I'm going to come to Otago University, and make reference to University in Dunedin, and I'm going to kill everybody. So that day, in the ODT, appears the fact that the university has been put into lockdown. In a national newspaper, front page, university being put into lockdown because of the threat made on this particular social media channel. That single event, when the intelligence service says, oh no, we weren't monitoring these chat rooms, we didn't know what was going on there, that demonstrates to you that that's actually not correct. They obviously knew about the event to be able to turn around and put the university into lockdown. And that is only 5 years, or actually 4 years, before Brenton Tarrant will actually carry out his attack on the mosque in Christchurch and kill over 51 people. How's that possible? And then, of course, we have the other aspect of things. And we go back to our friends at the Pacific Project Democracy. In New Zealand Project Democracy, Hugh Templeton was also, and Les Gander, the Minister of Education, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Hugh Templeton, along with high-ranking military and naval personnel, they were directors of a company called Stephen Andrews Limited, or SM Andrews Limited, set up by Stephen Andrews, who was an old boy, wearing the right tie, knowing the right handshakes, chap, out from Christ College, who ended up working with Americans' intelligence services in Laos and Cambodia and Thailand in the 1970s. And came back to New Zealand and had set up an arms dealing company, SM Andrews, of which had all these national ministers who were very good friends of Richard V. Allen, the National Security Advisor that tried to sue me. It had a subsidiary called Minerva Security. So if you remember when the Phoenix Foundation tried to invade the island in Tonga, here we have another reference to Minerva, which, when you actually start to look into the history of Minerva, which included this was a subsidiary of SM Andrews. It was led by former members of the Rhodesian and South African Defence Forces. So special forces of people that were from very much far-right racist organisations. The word manoeuvre makes a lot of references to the old sort of Queen Victoria wearing the helmet. She's the Greek, the Martian god of war, but it appears all throughout um, art and symbolism of the empire. So it's a symbol of basically of white patriarchal imperialism. So again, I mean, there is a living proof of you this far right under our knees, totally working side by side with ministers, intelligence services, high-ranking military people. And it's not the only one, because you might have also remembered from a couple of programs ago I talked about Paladin Security, which was run by the Otto Skorzeny, the bodyguard to Adolf Hitler, who was also, after the war, part of this paramilitary unit that the CIA had set up inside of NATO to wage secret war on the Russians, called Gladio. Well, in Australia, while we got manoeuvre over here in New Zealand, in Australia they had another organisation also called Paladin, using the same checkered, black and white checkers, the horse's head, lots of references which would overlap to that whole far right imperialism symbolism. And today they're one of the biggest people that actually are running the prisons and for immigration centres in Australia. Very, very racist, where lots of abuse actually takes place. They are now moving into the privatisations of the prisons, which of course is also happening here in New Zealand, but with Serco and other companies like SG4. So we're looking at these agencies, our security forces and our apparatus security, which includes prison. More and more we've seen this element of private business creeping into it, what they call public-private partnerships, and the elements that are involved in it, again, have that link when you look back into either far right or to, again, this conservative religious element. So, for example, you have, again, I mentioned the company, the agency Cordia, which we'll get into a little bit down the road. But Cordia, when you turn around, you look at who they work for. They've got a security company called Aurora. They've got people in there that are social engineering and psychologists, and yet they're also people that are members of the Mormon Church and the Seventh-day Adventists. And again, you've got this white conservative Christian component within our own security intelligence services, which we're all being told, oh, this is what we need to look out for, and yet it's right in front of you. Get rid of them, clean them out. We'll be done and fun. Of course, another thing in the 1980s with Project Democracy was that you had the assistance of us assisting this whole Iran-Contra arming of right-wing elements in South America and the Taliban in Afghanistan. But that actually extended to, in my book State Secrets in 1999, I write about how Peacelink in 1991 report that a gun shop owner, David Tipple, a seven-day Christian fundamentalist, was helping provide people involved in the Iran-Contra provide Chinese-based weapons to the Contras in Central America as part of the Iran-Contra affair. So again, when you look at 73 Minerva, 80 Santos, 1987 Fiji coup, 1995 Bougainville, and we have again this component of the Iran-Contra. We get David Tipple, the man that not only provided guns to Brenton Tarrant, the man that would carry out the shootings in Christchurch on March 15th, but extended, he actually was the same guy that provided weapons to David Gray, who carried out a mass shooting in Aramoana. So this is the same guy that got arrested for doing dodgy things with weapons, bringing them in, trying to get them out of America, spent a year in an American jail, told that he's not allowed to try and fly anymore because he's a dangerous person, but then ends up being able to go to Australia because someone makes a few calls and lifts a few strings from so that he can go and see his daughter, when you and I obviously wouldn't be able to do this, perform as an athlete in Australia. This man had been repeatedly, serially getting involved in dramas of one kind or another, which showed that he was not, him or his family were not fit, proper people to run a gun store. And yet, not only is this man still operating today and is opening up more and more stores despite the events of March 15th, he's had the situation where these same people, these newspapers that go on about outright conspiracy theorists and we need to crack down on these people, these were the same people that were running full-page adverts for Gun City full-page adverts. You know, they're not cheap. Saying, pimp up your ride. The adverts literally were encouraging people to look upon their rifle as not as a hunting equipment, not as a device for culling conservation, not as a farming tool, but they're looking upon saying, pimp your ride, and giving all these ways that they could actually add accessories to your semi-automatic, which was designed to make it look like a war toy for the purpose of not for killing rabbits or possums or anything but killing people. And this man flooded the streets with these cheap weapons, and nobody did anything. And then when it actually takes place, everybody acts surprised. Think about that. Same time, it wasn't just the fact that old Brenton Tarrant came along and carried out the shooting, and who would have known this was ever going to happen? Brenton Tarrant left Australia for New Zealand in 2010. From 2010 to 2016, he just literally disappears off the face of the earth, and nobody in the mainstream has ever talked about this. There hasn't been the royal inquiry about any explanation about where he actually is. He is just a ghost. It is the elephant in the room these 6 missing years, and nobody wants to talk about that and saying how strange it is. In the same time frame we know that Brenton Tarrant, because in his own writings had said that he had been there, 6 Australians ended up in the Ukraine fighting for a nationalist organisation called the AGOV, A-G-O-V. They were a neo-Nazi affiliated organisation, so just like before I talked about the neo-Nazis, the HVO fighting in Croatia, you have the AGOV in Ukraine. They were largely funded and armed and trained by a combination of Israeli people involved in their intelligence, security, and military-industrial complex, or American. So you have these people, again, this connection of these neo-Nazis who have always previously been in connection to the West during the Balkans conflict in Bosnia, again, being in bed with the West. And this is where, just like Osama bin Laden were helped the Americans undermine the Soviets in Afghanistan, we see all these 6 Australians going off to fight in these wars, which again are backed by the Western Intelligence Agency. So these agencies actually created these people, and now they've come back to bite us in the ass, and they're washing all connections they have to these people, or the signs that they were actually, were a problem, and pretending it didn't exist. But that's actually, when you look at it, is the fact. Again, I said, just far-right security companies, mercenaries, which have these symbolisms which are just soaked in racist, white, patriarchal imperialism, and we go, well, we had no idea that was going to come about. Well, you did, because you were paying them. Okay? And literally, when you look at the case of Carl Chapman, and I'm going to have to wrap the show up today, so we'll get into some of the more what happened on the day of March 15th itself next week. When you look at people like Carl Chapman, who's the former member of the National Front, who set up the Resistance B, I think they're just called the Resistance, but the point is that they're the same organisation which was sending mercenaries to Ukraine and Australia, head of a chapter in New Zealand, set up by Carl Chapman, and that's the same organisation. That we'll get into that next week, actually, because we will get into that. But the point was that Carl Chapman began getting his money from the state as a neo-Nazi as early as the 1994s, when Jim Bolger from the Prime Minister's office was paying money for him to give money to homeless skinhead, which everyone I ever talked to says, what homeless skinhead? Money given to this guy? No really accountability? Nobody wants to talk about that anymore. And that's the fact. When you actually look at a lot of the far-right components, they trace back to either the security forces or as informants for police intelligence. And we will carry on with that point next week when you come back and find the final and last chapter on our State of Terror, Road to 9/11 to March 15th on Fresh FM on the Deadline Reports. And do check out my website, which is simply Postman Productions, or Ben Vidgen Postman Productions. Got a little donation box, and that's how we kind of make this actually happen. So dig and give kindly. Take care all.